Hi everyone, this is Stephanie Nishio with the California Association of Food Banks. Thank you for joining us for our ABAWDs 101 webinar. We have Jessica Barcelo with the Western Center on Law and Poverty with us, as well as Jared Call with California Food Policy Advocates. We are having this webinar today to talk about the ABAWD rule. As you may have been hearing in the media, it's starting to roll out throughout the country, and although California's waiver goes for at least about a year and a half longer, we wanted to start having the conversation with you and making sure that everybody is up to date and that our outreach community is ready to take the lead when the time limits come back into California. But just real quick before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about logistics. We are recording the webinar, and we will be posting it along with the slides on our website. And if you have questions as we're going along, we're going to go ahead and take them at the end. But if you have them while Jared and Jess are talking, go ahead and type them into the little box on your control panel, and we will address them at the end. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jared.
Thank you, Stephanie, and I do want to thank Stephanie and the California Association of Food Banks for coordinating this webinar, and also thank Jess and Western Center for being on and sharing her expertise. This is a really important change in the CalFresh program that's coming, and as Stephanie mentioned, it's been rolling out across the country, and we'll discuss some of the really negative impacts that it's had in places where it's already returned, and the importance of California and counties and all of us here on the call to preparing as well as possible for the return to help mitigate any potential harm. It's not an accident that the title of this presentation, the return of the 3-month time limit, reads a little bit like the subtitle of an old monster movie or something, because it is a very onerous rule, and without proper preparation, it really could have some really deleterious, disastrous impacts. So to run over today's agenda quickly, we'll do an overview of the rule, which is pretty complicated. We won't get too far into the very thick weeds of the rule today. It's just kind of an intro to give people a sense of what will be happening and when it will be happening, and the broad steps that need to be taken to prepare. And that'll really start with talking about who will be impacted by the rule and who is an ABAWD. And then we'll move into some of the key issues, particularly for application assisters, knowing what the status is of California's waiver from the rule, talking about the importance of screening and accurately tracking ABAWDs and the various potential exemptions they may have from the time limit. Jess is going to talk about some of the political context and messaging around this rule. That's very important to keep in mind as we do take the message out into the community. And then we're going to spend some time on ways to help eligible ABAWDs keep their benefits when faced with the rule. And an important part of that, and an important part of that for this group, is informing and preparing all of our community partners. So we can move on now to who is an ABAWD. It is a really bad acronym. It stands for Able-Bodied Adults Without Dependents. And as Stephanie mentioned at the opening, you may have heard in the news about the time limit returning to various states and things like the return of the time limit or work requirements, which Jess will discuss the difference between those terms and why we use time limit instead of work requirements, and hearing about people getting cut off and losing their benefits. And so moving on to who is an ABAWD, the definition here is anyone between 18 and 49 who is not disabled and not living with anyone under 18 in their household and not otherwise exempt. And we'll talk a lot today about those exemptions. And I think it's important to talk about the characteristics of this group. I think sometimes they're portrayed in the media as people who don't have many barriers because they are able-bodied and don't have dependents to take care of. But a look at the demographics of this group shows that they are one of the very poorest groups, even among those participating in CalFresh. And they're not eligible for many other public benefits, like the Earned Income Tax Credit or CalWorks, and they're the only group that is actually taxed deeper into poverty by the federal income tax. About half of ABAWDs are women, and a good deal of them are veterans as well. So it's important to have an accurate picture of who this group is, because they are truly very, very much at risk. So what is the 3-month time limit in general? What is the ABAWD time limit rule? It was rolled out as part of the 1996 welfare reform, and the gist of it is that for those who are in the category of ABAWDs, their CalFresh benefits are limited to only 3 full months in a 36-month period, unless they are working 20 hours a week. And it's important to note that unlike SNAP or CalFresh Employment and Training, job search does not count toward fulfilling those 20 hours a week. And that's part of why this rule really shouldn't be thought of as a work requirement. It really is just a harsh time limit because it doesn't measure someone's willingness to work. It measures their ability and in some cases good fortune in being able to work 20 hours a week or 80 hours averaged over a month. So if somebody were able to work 18 or 19 hours a week, they would still be subject to this time limit and could lose their benefits. The other ways an individual could not be subject to the time limit are, again, being homeless or meeting one of the other exemptions that we'll talk about moving forward. So this is just an illustration, I think, that really shows what can happen when states don't prepare well for the return of the time limit. This is what happened in Kansas. You'll see that triangle is when the time limit was reimposed, and you'll see the caseload declining, and then a really precipitous decline right at the 3-month mark after the time limit was reimposed. And so that just shows this is a sort of a bad case scenario of what could happen if we don't prepare as well as possible here in California. So moving on to the key issues for application assisters as we covered in the top. The first is knowing the waiver status of the county that you're in. We'll talk about how those waivers are determined and what the timeline is for California learning which counties will or won't receive that waiver. It's very important for us to support effective county screening. There's going to be a lot of work to be done in identifying ABAWDs and doing face-to-face screenings to determine possible exemptions for ABAWDs. And then using that, of course, with the goal of helping ABAWDs to keep and restore benefits. And as we will talk at the end, informing the community right away about the importance of the return of this rule and the complex nature of it and getting the word out is going to be a really important part of those preparations. So waivers from the time limit, part of the rule is that states can request waivers from USDA, waivers from the time limit, and that's based on areas or the state at large having a relatively high unemployment rate. During the recession, all states in the country had a waiver from the time limit, but as the economy is improving, states are unable to secure those waivers as their unemployment rate drops. And so as Stephanie mentioned at the outset, California's waiver will continue to be statewide through the end of 2017. So it'll return on January 1st, 2018. So the good news is that California does have more time than other states and can learn some lessons from other states, some hard lessons, some good lessons. But the bad news, and I think this is a really important point to stress, is that counties and the state will be implementing the rule for the first time in a really long time, in years. So administrators and clients are probably, many of them are going to be unfamiliar with these very complex rules, and that's just an additional challenge that we're going to face as we roll out. And so with that, I'll turn it to Jess to provide some more of the context and some of the history of this rule in California. Jess?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jared. And just for people on the phone, this is Jessica Bartholow with the Western Center on Law and Poverty. I work in our Sacramento office, and I just want to say thank you to all of you who work day in and day out with people who are applying for CalFresh or who've been kicked off CalFresh and need help getting back on. This is really hard work, and it takes a lot out of you to see somebody in crisis and to see somebody who's hungry. I know what that's like, and it's the reason I work on policy instead of direct service. It's very difficult work, and I couldn't do it. So I just want to say thank you to you all who do that work. It's important. And the other thing I'd like to say to you in context to this webinar and to what we're hoping to get out, and Stephanie will tell a little bit more about it, is that we really need you. You know, we're going to have to create a feedback loop with all of you to know what's working, what's not, to not just to see how things roll out. And as Stephanie said, we're going to need you to be the front line when this rolls out. but also to help us think through what aren't we thinking about when we're developing the policy itself. You know, 2017 seems kind of far off. We've got some time, December 2017, but we actually have to have, you know, we're anticipating that the policy needs to be set no later than January in order, you know, in writing in January, in order for the computer systems to be programmed to accommodate this new rule and prevent it against cuts to this population. So with that, I wanted to, I'll go through a couple of slides to talk about how do we distinguish, how are we talking about this time limit vis-a-vis what a work rule is, because sometimes people will toggle back and forth and refer to the time limit as a work requirement. And so I'm going to talk through what, you know, how to speak about the work rule and what the national context is, how we can be helpful to the national context, as well as keep our eyes on the ball here in California. So just answering the basic question, is the ABAWD time limit a work rule? No, it is not a work rule. It is a time limit. And the time limit, again, applies for people, it applies to all able-bodied adults without dependents, and after the 3-month time limit, there is a work obligation that people have to be compliant with in order to receive benefits after that 3 months. But it is, you know, but the rule itself is referred to as a time limit. So how is the ABAWD time limit different or related to SNAP Employment and Training Program? So here in California, we passed a law. Many of you helped to do this or helped to educate policymakers about the importance of it. About 4 years ago now, SB 43 by Senator Carol Liu. That bill, what it did was it prevented us from having what's called a mandatory employment and training program anytime that unemployment is high. And we defined what unemployment was high as the same qualification used to determine whether or not a county is eligible for an ABAWD waiver. So what that means is that anytime there's an ABAWD waiver in place in a county, that county is not allowed to have a mandatory employment and training program. What it also means is that when some counties become eligible again for, when some counties lose their eligibility for the ABAWD waiver, those counties will then be eligible to, if they wanted, if they chose to, employ a mandatory employment and training program. The mandatory employment and training program, though, isn't something that's good for recipients, and especially not good when it's side by side the ABAWD time limit. It becomes then two rules that are a little bit different and complicated working together, and can impact the recipients in different ways. And so it is something I want you to pay attention to, a question to ask, and to note that it's something we don't want. You know, California does not want to have any mandatory employment and training programs returned to the counties once they are ineligible for the ABAWD waiver. We'd like them to be able to participate in a voluntary employment and training program. And so let me talk about the difference. In the mandatory employment and training program, the county assigns somebody to mandatorily work a certain number of hours per week, per month, and if they don't comply with that, then they're sanctioned. And the sanction lasts for a longer period of time than an ABAWD time limit sanction. An ABAWD time limit, if the person's not working the requisite hours, if they begin working those hours, they get put back on aid. But under mandatory employment and training, the first time you fail to meet the hours, you get sanctioned a month. The second time, 3 months. The third time, 6 months. You can be sanctioned for a longer period of time, and even if you become employed and you're working the requisite number of hours or more, your sanction remains for that period of time. So mandatory employment training is just, it's not a policy we want to see returned. So keep an eye on that if your county is one that is losing an ABAWD waiver. The second thing I want to say is, so you heard me talk about voluntary employment and training. Well, voluntary employment and training is something we absolutely want. And what this is it is the county saying to SNAP recipients that they would be eligible for employment and training services, could be community college in some places, could be, there's restaurant training, front-end restaurant training. There's various different kinds of employment and training programs that are out there that could be a voluntary employment and training programs. And right now, you might have heard that the United States Department of Agriculture has put an expert on employment and training programs in every regional office. We have one here in the Western Region office that's doing a really great job of getting out to the community and finding out what employment and training programs work and should be made available for free to SNAP recipients to support their search for work and remove barriers for work like prior convictions, expunging records, making sure people have eyeglasses if they are drivers, for example, or teeth if they have to work a front-end job. So actually working on removing barriers and supporting people in securing employment in real intangible ways and in ways that make people want to volunteer for a placement. So that's the difference between mandatory employment training and voluntary employment training. One last thing I would like to say about this is that we do have, we can celebrate that we are launching this year. It's actually a relaunch of what's called Fresh Success. Fresh Success is employment and training program at 3 community colleges. It's a return of a program that we started in 2009 and had run for 2 years before it got disallowed by the United States Department of Agriculture. And now we're able to bring it back with renewed process for funding. And it's just one of the ways in which we're trying to expand employment and training opportunities for CalFresh recipients in California. But if you know in your community that you have an employment and training program that really works and could use match funding from the United States Department of Agriculture through the California Department of Social Services, reach out to your county and talk to them. We know that, for example, the Ella Baker Center just received about $4 million with some other groups in Alameda County to provide employment and training for a reentry population. And they are coordinating with consultants and the USDA and DSS and their county to figure out how to match those dollars in order to bring home more placements, have more placements for people in their community. Just like the CalFresh outreach program works with match funding, so could an employment and training program. So from this, I want you to take away from this slide, the ABAWD time limit is not a work rule, it's a time limit. There are work rules in the program. We know about the student work rule, and we also know about the mandatory employment and training, which is not in place in California, but could come back if we're not diligent in our local advocacy. And third, we support voluntary employment and training placements, and if you have ideas for how to expand and talk to your counties about that, feel free to reach out to us or DSS or your county directly. Next slide. Great. So as we have these conversations in California, it's really important to think about the fact that it's part of a federal conversation. Just next week, we expect a proposal to be released by House Speaker Ryan that will make significant and unprecedented and really dangerous proposals for anti-hunger programs, things like block granting, for example. And much of the dialogue, I call it politicking on the place of poor people, much of the dialogue has to do with whether or not somebody deserves these benefits, whether or not people are working, and if they're not working or can't show that they're looking for work, they don't deserve to prevent hunger. And so whatever you say here in California, with our media market being as important as it is, with us having more members of Congress in California than any other state, with us having more SNAP recipients than any other state, and SNAP eligible populations than any other state, whatever we say here will impact that national dialogue, and so we want to be at least aware of the federal context. So the federal context begins with the fact that the ABAWD provision, the able-bodied adults without dependents time limit, was it came to being as part of welfare reform, sometimes referred to as PROA, the personal responsibility and opportunity for work. I think I might have too many R's in there, but welfare reform in 1996. This is important to note because this welfare reform will commemorate its 20th year anniversary on August 26th of this year. And so you're going to hear a lot about welfare reform in the news. As we think about ABAWD and it coming to California and the potential impact of hundreds of thousands of people could be losing food benefits because they can't show enough work hours, it's important to note that this anniversary may bring about that conversation. And this was a provision that had a lot of controversy. Remember, it was signed by Clinton, but it was a Republican House plan, welfare reform, and this provision was greatly detested by people who signed the bill. I think even the administration was uncomfortable with this provision, even though they signed it. So just remember, this is not something people liked, and it's something we would like to remove if possible. There are some pieces of legislation that will remove the policy, and I'll talk about those in a minute. Also, there's this politicization of work, and kind of, trying to differentiate, federal actors trying to differentiate between who is a deserving person and who is not a deserving person. And what we would like to do is really push up against that and remind people about the bipartisan nature of SNAP. That SNAP was born out of a bipartisan goal to end hunger in America, with an acknowledgement that lacking food is a violation of human rights, and that without food, it's really hard to find a job. And so, I want to encourage people not to fall into the trap of talking about how ABAWDs are good people and therefore deserve to have food, but rather think about a broader context of the fact that without food it's actually really hard to find work, that you could be searching for work, but because somebody doesn't give you a job or even give you enough hours, you still aren't complying with the job. The fact that if you could live in a rural area and you don't have transportation to go job searching or to get to work, and that many jobs these days don't guarantee you 20 hours of work. You may be working 20, 30 hours a week, and then all of a sudden, at a low-wage job, and then all of a sudden you get cut back. There's many reasons why low-wage workforce can't guarantee a 20-hour work week, and that shouldn't result in them being hungry. And because being hungry doesn't actually help them comply with mandatory work requirements or the time limit. And then state actions. So our state is a really good actor here, right? We have policy in place. The California Food Policy Advocates led us in policy change with the California Hunger Action Coalition over a decade ago to set into statute a law that said that if a county was eligible for a waiver, that the state should seek a waiver and that the county must accept it unless there was a vote by the Board of Supervisors to not accept the waiver. And this policy just kind of sets in stone that we will have waivers in those communities unless there's a public process. And there really, even after the bill passed and when there were still counties that qualified for waivers, there were only 2 counties that ever were qualified for a waiver and denied using it, voted against using it. The California Association of Food Banks actually organized with local food banks to help move those counties, and finally there were no counties with eligibility for a waiver which denied it. So we are in a good place. However, other states who are eligible for waivers for part of their state or all of their state have actually moved in anticipation, and even before they lost their waivers for some or part of their state, they repealed the waiver. One state actually said, you know what, we're going to pass a law that says we can never accept a waiver. So there's some state actors out there that have been really bad actors and are intentionally creating hunger in their communities. And so it's important to understand that context. You might also hear the news that some states are, in addition to the ABAWD waiver coming into place, some states are imposing newly mandatory employment and training programs. So they're intentionally adding 2 new provisions on the tops of people who are very poor and hungry without these benefits. And that's how we see a lot of people being cut off the programs across the state, across the country, hunger increasing. And what we're finding is that in those communities, the anti-hunger advocates like yourselves and us are unable to even contact them. It's hard to, you know, when somebody drops out of TANF or somebody drops out of SNAP, it's really difficult to document what happens to these families because they're so deeply impoverished that they're difficult to monitor and to track, even for academics. And when populations like that disappear kind of off the map, and we are unable to track them, it becomes very difficult to restore their benefits and organize a policy change that would protect them because, you know, they're kind of invisible. So I spoke about the California context. One more thing I just want to add is that we did have legislation. People might have been aware of that we had legislation last year and again this year that would have completely removed the ability for our Board of Supervisors to deny a waiver when they want it. So right now, again, I said a Board of Supervisors could vote in a public vote to not accept the waiver. We have legislation that would have eliminated that provision and just sort of said they had to take it if they had one available. But again, this year, as in last year, it was held in the Senate Appropriations Committee. So that bill is not moving forward. Let's go ahead to the next one. So I mentioned, you know, the federal context. We talked about the federal context. One of the things we can really help with is to get sign-ons and be talking about these 2 pieces of legislation, one in the House and one in the Senate. The House legislation, HR 1025, it just simply says, look, before you cut somebody off of the, due to the time limit, you have to offer them education and training or a community service site before terminating them. We had legislation last year that would have required that in California, and it got held in appropriations with a very costly price tag, which is appropriate. You know, it actually would cost a lot of money to make sure that everybody has a job placement before you cut them off, and that's you know, but it's consistent with the rhetoric, right? That if what we want is people to have a job, well, then we should make sure that we offer them one before cutting them off. And the current policy is not consistent with that rhetoric. The second one, the Senate bill, S-2420, does the same thing as a House bill, but also adds some protections for veterans. I know that you see a lot of veterans in your work. You know, as a reminder, California has more, you know, more veterans in more homeless veterans than any other state in the country. We have about 1/4 of the country's homeless veteran population here, and there are some special protections that we will have in rolling out ABAWD for that population. So please be on the lookout for special guidance for that population as well. But you can weigh in, you can send letters of support. Make sure and talk about these pieces of legislation when you're talking about the ABAWD time limit. These are important responses to the time limit and should be mentioned. And then finally, the other things that you can do to help with the national conversation and messaging is just, you know, documenting the implementation that we're doing, and we'll try to do that from the statewide level. But if you have county-specific information about implementing, you know, who the target population is, who the impacted population is, you know, and as we go along, what the outcomes have been, or any best practices that come up. You know, I think in California, because I think we will do a good job, it will be our responsibility to document what worked and why it should be pursued in other states. And I think that that's my last slide, Stephanie. And so I'm passing it over to Stephanie, who's going to be talking to you and kind of getting you ready for your face-to-face visit coming up in June, so that we can prepare to have the final conversation there about getting your guidance about policy implementation in California. Thank you.
Jess, that was a great lead-in, but we're actually going to throw it back to Jared to talk about identifying ABAWDs, and then at the end I'll wrap up with the peer-to-peer at the end of the month.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie, and thanks, Jess, for that great background and the importance of helping with the messaging on this, not just in California, but at the national level. So the first step in helping to mitigate the negative impact of the return of this rule is to properly identify who is an ABAWD and where are ABAWDs residing, so that we can get the word out to those individuals that this rule is returning, the time limit's returning, and they need to come and meet with their county worker and see if they are indeed subject to it. We've heard a lot of bad stories from other states where when states weren't prepared, they misidentified people as ABAWDs that shouldn't have even been in that bucket, that maybe they were even over the age 50 and things like that. So we really need to know, again, where and how many ABAWDs there are in the state. And this is especially challenging because, you know, counties haven't been doing this maybe as diligently during this long waiver period, and they may not have everything in the case file that could apply to an ABAWD and potentially exempt them from the time limit, like how much they may be volunteering at their local church, or whether they're pregnant, or whether they recently broke their leg, all these kind of things that would make them either unfit for work or help them satisfy the 20 hours per week threshold. And as some counties have implemented new technologies and maybe moved away from face-to-face interviews, there's this additional challenge that sorting whether the time limit and the categorization even applies to an individual, in most cases, requires a real individual assessment. So counties need to be able to track where ABAWDs are and be able to notify them well in advance to give them time to come in and be for exemptions. And this group here on the webinar can play a really valuable role in helping counties to do just that. We can go to the next slide, Steph. So after identifying those who may be subject to the time limit, how can we help them keep their benefits? And this is where it's really important to engage your county and do it right away and ask them, you know, how are you identifying the ABAWDs in your county? We've looked at the statistics and the reporting from the state, and it quite frankly probably isn't as accurate as it needs to be able to implement this rule in a way that doesn't improperly cut people off of their benefits. So asking your county, how are you identifying, and what are your plans to notify ABAWDs about the return of the rule and the timing, and how are you making any changes to your application forms, your reporting forms, or your procedures to properly screen anyone who may be subject to the time limit? And the second piece is to reach out to ABAWDs in the community and inform them through notices that we can all develop together about the return of the time limit and who should be subject to it and who shouldn't be, and making sure that people know where to go and when to go to make sure that they do so in a timely way, so that if they aren't actually subject to the time limit, that they receive that exemption, and the county knows for how long that exemption should apply, so that they can inform them again when they need to come in and see how their circumstances may have changed. We can go to the next slide. So we've talked a lot about exemptions. This is a list which is actually not even a complete list of some of the ways that that ABAWDs should be exempted from this time limit. So residing in a household with anyone who's under 18. If you're pregnant, you're not subject to the time limit. Physically or mentally unfit for work. That's a really important exemption category that we're going to spend a little more time on, because if applied correctly and as broadly as the flexibility allows, it could really keep a lot of people on the program who really need it to be able to live their lives. And there, as Jess mentioned, there has been some recent guidance from USDA that in some ways is expanding this definition of unfit for work. A really critical one that came out last November was that anyone who's categorized as chronically homeless is exempt from the time limit. And so defining chronically homeless in as broad a way as possible will be really important. I mean, it should be just people who just lack access to any stable nighttime residence. So screening forms specific to that categorization will be really important, and identifying that very at-risk population and reaching out to them to make sure that they've informed the county about their status so that they can keep their benefits. And as Jess mentioned the new guidance on veterans, that veterans receiving any VA disability assistance, regardless of the level of that assistance, are not subject to the work to the time limit, and we'll be working with the state and counties to make sure that that's implemented correctly too. We talked about students who are at least attending or working half-time are not subject. Requalifying. So if you do meet that work threshold, you can regain eligibility. It's important to make sure that clients are communicating that with the county. And then, as Jess said, if someone is already exempt from the general CalFresh work requirements, they're not subject to the ABAWD work or ABAWD time limit. And then there are some additional exemptions, but we won't spend too much time on those today. We're gonna really spend more time on the unfit for work exemption. So this is really from the regulation, and it's so it reads medically certified as physically or mentally unfit for work, and that means they could receive not that. So it's important to distinguish that from the more general CalFresh definition of disabled, which then has a different set of income requirements and potential deductions. This is really any type of temporary or permanent disability benefits, whether they be public or private. And the regulation rules that the individual must be obviously unfit as determined by the state, or in this case maybe county agency. And if that is not obvious, the client can provide a statement from a pretty long list of eligible medical professionals, and so it'll be important to make sure that all of these types of medical professionals are provided with the types of screening forms that could help identify people in this category of unfit for work. And I think the next slide has some examples of those screening forms from the Pennsylvania Department of Health Services, and these are a little fuzzy, and we'll be happy to post these with the webinar if people would like to see those. But these are pretty simple forms that just ask a medical provider to answer a few simple questions about their participant. If they're pregnant, if they're participating in a drug and alcohol treatment or counseling program, or a mental health counseling program, or if the patient has a mental and or physical illness or disability which reduces his or her ability to financially support his or herself. So these types of materials will be really important to develop and circulate widely to any entity or person who could help certify a person's status. And so one thing we haven't talked as much about is capturing all qualifying work activities and making sure that application and reporting forms, CalFresh forms, collect all the information that could help someone meet that work threshold. It's important to remember that this is an area where it's not about income, it's really about hours. Hours are the threshold that need to be counted. And it's important to capture all those qualifying activities. If somebody is working 18 hours a week and thinks that they might be subject to the time limit, maybe they're volunteering at their church or a school for 2 hours a week, and that right there would combine and allow them to keep those benefits. And again, standalone job search doesn't count, but it can be combined with other types of qualifying work activities, as long as job search doesn't make up more than half of the time. So that is less than 10 hours per week. So that's another important detail to note. Next slide, I guess. So informing the community, and as we've said throughout, this is a really important topic for this group to reach out, immediately to county workers and county decision makers to make sure they're aware, first of all, of the return of the time limit, and ask those questions we've identified to help them prepare in terms of how are you identifying your ABAWDs, what is your plan to reach out and notify folks. And also making sure that food pantries and other service providers are aware of the return of the rule, because it is likely that if as people may be cut off, there will be a rush to access those resources, and also an increase in requests for work and volunteer work at those facilities. And obviously we're starting the process here of reaching out to partnering organizations and community members, and are hoping that we can continue to get the word out, and the upcoming the meeting at the end of June, the peer-to-peer meeting, will be an important step toward that. So we've just listed some additional resources. The Center on Budget and Policy Priorities has been doing a lot of great work on this. They have some great materials and some great, pretty concise summaries of the rule, and are doing a good job of documenting the impact. Of course, the Food Research and Action Center always has great materials and resources. And at CFPA, we'll be posting on our CalFresh page any new guidance or new developments and implementation information as we go through this process in the next few months. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Stephanie to talk about some homework.
All right. So thank you, Jared and Jess. You did a great job of explaining a really complex topic and kind of getting us moving toward being ready for implementation. So many of you are coming to the peer-to-peer meeting in 3 weeks in Oakland, and I have some homework for you. That's at the peer-to-peer meeting. We're going to go a little bit deeper on ABAWDs, and as Jess mentioned, we really need your expertise on your communities and your insight on how we can best reach folks. So in preparation for that, we are asking you to find out from your county how many ABAWDs are in your county, and then to do some pre-thinking about how you can identify ABAWDs in your community and how you can reach hard-to-reach populations, and just be ready to come to the meeting, ready to talk about how we can reach out to ABAWDs and how we can educate the community. Jess or Jared, is there anything you wanted to add to that assignment real quick?
No, I think that's a really great and important first step.
Yeah, I agree. That's right.
So we are going to go ahead and move into questions. If you have questions, go ahead and write them into the question box on your control panel, and I will go ahead and pose them to Jared and Jessica. We're going to start with who has a waiver and who doesn't, or what happens when one county has a waiver and when another doesn't. The question is, could you explain what happens when neighboring counties have different waiver rules and how that will work?
So Jared, I will take the first shot at that. Yeah, it is likely that beginning January 1, 2018, some counties will continue with waivers and some will not. And we won't know that until maybe as late as summer 2017. So we'll be doing a lot of preparations, and then there'll be some really focused preparation certainly in those counties who then will have been notified that their waiver will no longer be in effect on January 1, 2018. So it is important to know that somebody could live in one county that does have the waiver and move to a county that's unwaived. And in that case, when their case transfers, they would then need to be tracked and would need to be screened for any potential exemptions or fulfillment of the work hours threshold. I hope that's getting at the answer that people were looking for.
And a related question, could you talk about the precedent for counties applying the waiver for smaller geographical jurisdictions within their county when the entire county?
I can take that. I can take that question. So, we've talked a lot about the statewide waiver, the county waiver, but we didn't really mention too much the sub-county waiver. And so, the rule is that the state can apply as a whole, a county can apply, but also sub-county areas can apply. So, for example, in Alameda County, Oakland, the city of Oakland, has in the past had a city waiver. In San Francisco, we understand that San Francisco is preparing a waiver for the Tenderloin area with high unemployment and lack of access to jobs. Is a potential. If you have areas with concentrated poverty that are different than the rest of the county. If you live, for example, in an affluent county but have very concentrated poverty, you should be looking and talking to your counties about their application for a sub-county waiver. The state is required to process that waiver request for counties, but we haven't really pushed too hard on whether or not they're required to process one for sub-county areas. We're just asserting that they are, and you should too. It does make it more complicated, right? So don't deny when you talk to your counties that this would make it more difficult. You do have to figure out a way for somebody to identify, I live in this area and therefore I'm eligible for the waiver versus I live in this area. But the problem of cross-county, you know, from the problem of the difference between one county having a waiver and the other one not, or one part of the town, of the county having a waiver and the other one not, is the same problem. And so the counties have to figure it out anyway. Because there's some cities, for example, Lake Tahoe, where you might even have people who live on one side of the state line, and one state has the waiver in place and one state doesn't. So so it is something every county should be talking about. What happens when you have people who who frequently go across county lines or live across county lines, and how to address that. Or within a county, what will be the waiver request for the sub-county area, and then how will you prepare a plan to help people identify their residency in that area.
All right, we've got a couple questions on meeting the work requirement. So we'll start with the broader, more overarching one, which is, can you clarify the number of hours someone needs to volunteer or do ENT in order to maintain eligibility?
Sure, I can take that. It is 20 hours a week total, or 80 hours averaged over a month, and that can be any combination of workfare, in-kind work, qualifying employment and training program, or volunteering. If you volunteer 20 hours a week and you've verified that, you are not subject to the time limit. You've fulfilled the statutory requirement.
Thank you. And really quick before we go to the next question, I wanted to just remind folks that you should be typing in your questions, and we'll be answering them as they come up. So the other question regarding the meeting the work requirement is, once the waiver ends, if an ABAWD is working 20 hours per week, but after becoming approved for CalFresh, their work hours are reduced, will they have to report it mid-reporting period?
That is a very tricky question. I believe, and I will follow up on this, but I believe they do have to report a change in their hours. Jess, do I have that correct?
Yeah, they have to show that they're complying, and that they're with the rules of the time limit. So I don't know. What we don't know is whether or not that would have to be done within the following week. Like, what's the timeline of that reporting, or is it within the month? I believe it'd be within the following month, because of the you might have an average of 20 hours a week throughout that month, and I believe that will be allowable. If let's say, for example, you get sick and you can't do your 20, you don't end up going to work part of a week, but then the next week you're able to make up the time. Then that would count within the month. But that is exactly the kind of questions that we'll have to have answered in the guidance.
Yeah, and I think, oh, go ahead, Stephanie.
Sorry. I was just going to say that it's also an example of a really good question to bring to the peer-to-peer meeting when we're talking about ABAWDs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Jared,
I was just going to remind people that that the benefits are limited to 3 full months in the 36-month period. So if somebody were to receive benefits for less than that full amount for a full month, that month doesn't count against the 3-month time limit. That's another important detail that could really affect somebody's benefit level and well-being, that the counties really need to be aware of all these details.
Jared, there's a question about something you said when you were talking about what sort of activities count toward the work hours. I think you mentioned in-kind work, and there's a question about whether you can clarify what that is.
Yeah, in-kind work is any sort of work that's done for not cash, but that's different from volunteering where somebody may not receive any type of compensation. But if you are working in a bartering situation or for anything that is compensated that is not cash, so working out in trade basically.
Yeah, so we can give you an example. Somebody lets you stay in their spare bedroom, but in exchange, you're cleaning the house and doing the laundry and keeping the yard, but you're not getting a payment, and so that should count. The only thing I would say is that you know, if you do have people reporting that, you should also maybe just do a gut check and make sure that they're not in a situation that that might be they might be taken advantage of, right? And if that's the case, report, you know, maybe check in with the county about it. Sometimes we see at Legal Services people who are human trafficked, and that, you know, I think one of the human trafficking that gets a lot of attention is human sex trafficking, but there's also all kinds of layers of human trafficking where, you know, especially immigrant populations have been brought over and they're paying off their debt for their migration, or they're being kept or held in situations in which they're required to work at a restaurant or in a home and they're not being paid a wage, and that is not allowed under the law. And so if you do hear somebody working off in that way, if they seem like they're in trouble, that might be just a red flag to report.
That's a great reminder. Thank you. We have a question about the clock. If an individual receives benefits for 3 months and finds work but then later loses that job, does the 3-year period restart at that point, or does the 3-year period begin from when they first applied?
That's a really good question. California has decided there are a number of ways, without getting into all of them, that a state can apply the 36-month clock. And California has decided to implement what's called a statewide fixed clock. So that 36-month clock will start on January 1 and run for 36 consecutive months for every ABAWD in the state. And then every ABAWD's 36 months will restart 3 years after the initial start. So an ABAWD who uses up their 3 months but then finds work, there is actually a stipulation that then if they do meet that work requirement threshold, they gain an additional, it's called the second 3 months of eligibility. And those 3 months can only be used consecutively. So it's functions somewhat, you know, like sort of like not really a grace period, but it's a second chance if people are able to show that they met that work requirement after being cut off. But that doesn't impact the 36-month clock. I hope I've explained that well.
Just to reiterate, everybody, regardless of when you come on the program and start your 3 months, your clock, like that's not when your clock starts. Your clock has already started based on the statewide, right? Right.
The clock is the state is fixed for the state and not tied to any individual and when they come in or out of the program.
So kind of related to that, at what point can somebody who has already done their 3 months and somebody already did their 3 months but then they got a job, at what point can they reapply? Is there a waiting period?
No, they should immediately let the county know that they've begun to fulfill that requirement. And in fact, if they can show the county that they've been hired and they are likely to work 80 hours in any 30-day period, they should immediately regain eligibility.
Yeah.
They don't have to show retroactively that they've worked. They only need to show that they've been hired with the expectation that they will work 20 hours a week or 80 hours in the forthcoming 30-day period.
Do they have to show proof of that?
Yeah, they would
yes.
The employer.
Yeah, they would have to show proof. And actually, you know, as you guys all know who work in the field on outreach, work verification and anticipation of employment and things like that can be some of the hardest things, as well as termination of employment can be some of the hardest things to get verification for. So I think if you could bring with you your ideas for how to facilitate that, that reporting, maybe you'll have some thoughts that could be helpful for the statewide implementation.
There's also a question about if somebody finds work, do they, and they want to apply for benefits, after having already used their 3-month time limit or exhausted their 3-month time limit, do they have to do a new application, or can their case be restored?
Their case should be restored.
They don't have to reapply, they just have to show proof of employment.
Correct, as long as they haven't passed their certification period. They're still on the program.
Which is different than a mandatory work rule. A mandatory work rule, you're actually
That's important.
sanctioned. Yeah.
All right, are there any last-minute questions? We've gone, oh, actually, sorry, there is one more. Just your talking points on messaging went over well, and there's a question about whether there will be some sort of a fact sheet or a talking points available for folks so everybody can kind of be on the same page and use the same messages.
You know, I do have a fact sheet, and maybe we could post it with the webinar. The only thing is it's out of date because it mentions 2 pieces of legislation that would help the ABAWD community that were held in appropriations last Friday. So I have to update that, and perhaps we could post it with the webinar and material.
Great, thank you. And we have one last question. Are there any employer incentives that would assist employers in giving an ABAWD employee?
Oh, not that I know of.
But that's a great idea.
Well, there are some federal tax credits for people who hire SNAP recipients, but the tax credits are only received if the person doesn't receive food stamps 6 months later. So if you hire somebody who receives SNAP and then 6 months later they don't receive SNAP, then you get the tax credit. And so that's certainly not the case for this population, right? They'd be employed. You know, it is one of the things that some counties are looking into. As we mentioned before, it's possible that your county could set up a voluntary employment and training program that's specifically designed to help the ABAWDs meet their obligation for the time limit. And we know for a fact that some counties are choosing to look into this. Contra Costa County, I just heard today, is thinking about how to do this. How do we create voluntary slots, right? We had a bill that would have required them to. We lost the bill, but could the county still do it? Sure. Could they still get, you know, match funding from the state and the federal government to do it? Yep, they could. And so if you haven't talked to your county yet, you could be talking to your county about how they could help support and perhaps fund the oversight and administration of a program at a nonprofit. I think some of the food banks do this, for example, with your general assistance or general relief population. That population, if they have a work requirement, can come in and use and participate at a food bank or another nonprofit. A similar thing could be set up for the time limit, and you know, and maybe your county even would consider a grant to your nonprofit organization if you could provide so many slots. And so there's both, you know, people could be creating volunteer slots at nonprofits or paid slots at your nonprofit, or you know, trying to encourage participation within the business community. But for the purposes of having a tax credit for SNAP recipient hires, it really only applies if the person earns enough after 6 months to not be on the program. And to my knowledge, there's no other SNAP credit, tax credit, or benefit to that population.
All right. So thanks, Jess. We are going to go ahead and wrap up. Thank you, Jessica and Jared, for your wisdom and sharing all of your knowledge about ABAWDs. For everybody on the call, please do your homework before the peer-to-peer meeting. I'll go ahead and send out an email reminding everybody, and we are looking forward to continuing to work on this, so we're ready for implementation. Have a great weekend, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.